Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. It looks like midterms may have scared away the student population. But it is my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Princeton Lyman back to the Woodrow Wilson School, where he is no stranger, despite the Harvard PhD, of course. And he's here to deliver the Up to the Minute series on Sudan. And although Ambassador Lyman needs no introduction, he was the U.S. ambassador to both Nigeria and South Africa, as well as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs and a number of other prestigious roles inside the United States government. At the moment, he is a senior advisor at the UN Institute for Peace. Apologize. And he will be hopefully contextualizing the current crisis in South Sudan that began in December of last year, and seeing if we can draw any lessons from the South Sudan peace process that might apply to the current situation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Lyman.
I'm going to try and talk from here, and if the microphone's working, can you hear me? Okay, good, thanks a lot. We're in a situation today where, you look at one part of the diplomacy of the last few years having to do with Sudan and South Sudan, the successful conclusion of a peace process that was signed in 2005, the referendum, the independence of South Sudan. I'll come back to all these things. And we could mark that as a very successful period of conflict resolution diplomacy. And then, since last December, we see that with all the effort that went into the independence of South Sudan, 20 years of civil war, a great deal of suffering, millions of people had died, that within 2 years, 2.5 years of independence, the country has collapsed into a really awful civil war. And so how do we judge this? How do we put this into perspective? What do we say we've accomplished? What have we learned? If we've learned enough? And what happened? Why did it happen? And what are the dilemmas as we go forward? Let me just recap the history of this a little bit. I know many of you here know it well. Sudan became independent in 1956, and almost immediately there was conflict between the North and the South, and I'll come back to that, between the government in Khartoum and other parts of the country. But the conflict with the South resulted in 2 civil wars, one that ended in 1972, and then another that broke out and lasted for 20 years. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but basically, the North was largely, but not entirely, Arab, and largely, though not entirely, Muslim. And the South Sudan is almost entirely African, mostly Christian or traditional African religion. That was part of it. Part of it was a long period of neglect of the South, the lack of investment in the South, then efforts to enforce Sharia on the South during a period when the Sudan government was following an Islamist policy, etc. Now, what brought the United States into it? Why did it become a major concern of the United States? I was, and it depends on how you count, I was the 5th or 6th U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan, South Sudan, starting in the George W. Bush administration with the appointment of former Senator John Danforth, and then subsequently up to now, and my successor is the 6th or 7th, depending on how you count. Why did the U.S. get involved? We got involved, and Sudan, South Sudan is a good illustration of how domestic politics or domestic interests impact on foreign policy. Because in the George W. Bush administration, you had 3 important constituencies in the United States who made Sudan important. One was the evangelical Christian movement, who saw in the imposition of Sharia on a largely Christian population a religious discrimination and something that needed to be fought. Then you had the Black Caucus in the Congress that saw reports of continuing reports of slavery between the North, capturing black slaves in the South and selling them, and that enraged the Black Caucus. And then, just as we were getting to an end to this civil war, a rebellion broke out in the Darfur region of Sudan, which is in the western part of Sudan. And the government responded in such a horrific way that it was labeled by the US and later by the International Criminal Court as genocidal. And that brought another wave of domestic concern. Because here, this occurred around 2004, 10 years after the genocide in Rwanda, when people were holding conferences to say what went wrong 10 years ago, suddenly facing it happening again. So all of these converged on the Congress, on the administration, to say we've got to make Sudan an important case. Sudan, of course, was the largest geographical country in Africa. It was a bridge between the Middle East and Africa, so it had its strategic importance as well. The diplomacy that brought the Second Civil War to an end in 2005 was led by the Africans, particularly by the Kenyans, but by a regional group of countries in that part called IGAD, the Intergovernmental Group, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan now is a member, but with a heavy Western role being played by three countries, the United States, Norway, and Great Britain, as the Troika. And that intensive diplomacy, in which the United States played a very significant role, resulted in the peace agreement of 2005. Now, what that did was allow for a 6-year period during which the South would have autonomy, but there would be a government of national unity, and it would be 6 years for the South to decide whether staying inside Sudan was worthwhile. Could they make it attractive enough? At the end of which South Sudan would have the right of a referendum on whether they wanted to stay part of Sudan or become independent. And there was, right as we got closer and closer to 2011, two things that were clear. The South was going to vote for independence. That was clear. All the talk about you don't know how it was going to come out sort of disappeared. And the second was, is Sudan going to allow South Sudan to secede? 70% of the country's oil is in the South. Would Sudan actually go through with it? So an enormous amount of diplomacy was geared up during the Obama administration and with others to put a lot of pressure on the parties to go through with the referendum in 2011. I came into the envoy's office at that point. Obama went to the UN. There was a meeting of 40 or 50 heads of state putting a lot of pressure on the Sudanese. We also tried something, I'm not a great fan of them, but they're used often in diplomacy, a roadmap with the government of Sudan. We didn't have good relations with the government of Sudan. They had housed Osama bin Laden at some point in the past, and then there was the genocide in Darfur. But we laid out to the government of Khartoum a roadmap that if you do this and do this, then we will gradually move, lifting sanctions, taking them off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. It was useful in the diplomacy because it took the attention away from the US-Sudan issues and put the focus on settling the Sudan-South Sudan. Make a long story short, we can come back to all that was done to make it happen. But in the end, through a lot of effort, pressure, clever diplomacy by the South as well, and on our part, that South had its referendum, voted over 90% for independence. And then the question was, okay, 6 months later, they're to be independent. Will that happen? And it did, peacefully. Now, we had when I became the envoy, I got a list from the U.S. Institute of Peace of all the issues that had to be resolved for the South to become independent peacefully. How were you going to divide the oil? What were you going to do about borders? What were you going to do about citizenship? Because 2 million Southerners lived in the North. And a whole set of issues, down to about 6. They said if they're not solved by July 2011, there's going to be trouble. July 9th, 2011 came. South became independent. Not one of the issues had been resolved. So one of the things that we have to think about in what happened in South Sudan is where was the focus of all our attention from 2011 to 2013? A great deal of it was the resolution of these outstanding issues. Because if they weren't resolved, the the two now independent countries could go back to war. And there was a series of border clashes and bombing and this and that across the border. So the threat of war was real, if not all-out war, certainly a low-level war and conflict that would keep South Sudan from developing and Sudan from moving on. And we poured a lot of effort into those issues. Now, what did we learn from that process? Well, I think we learned a couple of things. Can you deal as a diplomat, let's say from the United States, with a government that you have a terrible relationship with, Sudan? Sudanese couldn't figure out why they should deal with us, because after all, we had all these sanctions, and by July, for reasons we can get back to, we didn't fulfill the roadmap. We didn't fulfill the roadmap because between the time we put the roadmap on the table and July 2011, another conflict had erupted in Sudan, this in the areas of southern Kordofan and Blue Nile. And just like in Darfur, the government was starving the people and bombing civilians. And we said, you know, we just can't go to the Congress and take you off the list of state sponsors of terrorism and lift sanctions when you're doing all of this. So the government said, well, you guys are just unreliable. You're always moving the goalposts. You're not reliable. How do you play a role in that case? I think what we were able to do was to walk a line between, that there's a certain area of relationships that are not going to get resolved in this way. But in terms of resolving the Sudan-South Sudan situation, we have a stake in it working. That is, in getting the issues resolved. And that means that if Sudan has a legitimate cause, a legitimate position in the negotiations, we can listen to that. We can take it and use the relative strength of our relationship with South Sudan to advocate for that. And I think we did that. We did that successfully on the oil issue and convinced the South Sudan that there had to be a payment, a compensation payment to Sudan for losing 70% of its oil. We did it on the borders. We did it on a number of other issues. And while we didn't have a perfect relationship with Sudan at the end, it was effective enough. And I should emphasize here that these negotiations were under the auspices of the African Union. We were not in the same lead position that we were in 2005. And why not? Well, because in the interim between 2005 and 2011, the International Criminal Court came in and indicted the president of Sudan, the Minister of Defense of Sudan, another key figure in the Sudanese government, for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity rising from the Darfur crisis. And we have a policy in the United States government not to deal with people who are indicted war criminals. Now that meant, in practical terms, that I could not deal with the president of Sudan. And if you want to take a lead in the negotiations between two parties and you're not talking to the president of one country, you can't really do that. So the African Union had to be in front. And they talked to President Bashir, and we sent messages to him through them. But it was very important for us to support the African Union effort because, quite frankly, and this took a lot of diplomacy in itself, the African Union couldn't do it by itself. It needed the backing of countries like the United States. It needed the backing of the Security Council for what it was doing, and that we could bring that to the table, and we worked out that relationship. Okay, we got to this summit of 2012, and all but one of the major issues was finally resolved. There was a big summit in Addis Ababa. Everybody came. Two presidents shook hands for the umpteenth time. They signed 9 agreements covering everything but one disputed area, Abyei. And it looked like those issues, which I had been told 2 years ago had to be resolved, were largely resolved. There was a breakdown a few months later, but they reinforced that in March of 2013. And it looked like, and it is to my knowledge still the case, that Sudan and South Sudan are not going to go to war again. But what about South Sudan? Now, let me go back to the domestic factors in our policy toward Sudan and South Sudan. Over 20 years, a strong body of American opinion American activists, American NGOs, congresspeople, became very close to the leaders of the South Sudan rebellion. They traveled with them, they advocated for them. Sudan, Bashir, all those genocidal people in Sudan, they were the enemy, and the South were the victims. These were the good guys. These were the people you defend. And that had an impact on the diplomacy. It had an impact because the South Sudanese were very, very good at saying, anybody who criticized them, but we got friends in Washington. We got friends in Washington who will say to you, oh, now you're being too friendly to Khartoum. Or the accusation that I received every time we made a single criticism of South Sudan, you're engaging in moral equivalency. You can't put on the same plane what South Sudan does in killing people in Jonglei province with the terrible things done in Sudan. And with all due respect, and these are wonderful people, and they're good friends of mine who advocated on behalf of South Sudan, we were not totally objective in the way we dealt with the problems inside South Sudan. And it took a long time for those friends of South Sudan to recognize that there were some fundamental problems in South Sudan that were not being resolved. Now, it isn't that nobody invested in South Sudan from 2005 to 2013. Huge amounts of money were spent in state building in South Sudan. They had an election, they established government, President Kiir brought all the competing militias together in a big tent, unified the country and the armies. They established provincial governments. They did all the things that one would want to see done in a formal sense. They did a transitional constitution, etc. Hundreds upon hundreds of people from the United States, from Britain, from Norway, from Kenya, from Ethiopia, from Uganda, were in South Sudan helping this ministry, helping that ministry, developing this, developing that. Developing what I would say is the administrative capacity of the state, but not necessarily dealing with the politics of the state. And of course, the administrative capacity was critical. South Sudan is a country of 85% illiteracy. The overwhelming majority of the parliament is illiterate. The overwhelming majority of the army is illiterate. The capacity of the government is very thin across all levels. So this enormous effort to build up administrative capacity was worthwhile. But what was going on in the politics? What was happening in the politics of South Sudan around which we did not have sufficient influence, etc.? One was that even by 2013, the government of South Sudan was more still a liberation army than a civilian government. It was, I compare it to South Africa. South Africa had a political movement, the African National Congress, formed in 1912. They had decades of working and developing its philosophy, et cetera. Yes, it had an armed wing developed in the 60s, et cetera, but it was a political movement with an armed wing. The SPLM, the Southern People's Liberation Movement, the movement of the South Sudanese, is a liberation army with a political wing. And that makes all the difference. The government was really a liberation army. It acted like a liberation army. Everybody in the government was an ex-general, if not a general. President Kiir put on his uniform from time to time, just in case you missed the point. And the party, the political mechanism to deal with political development was very weak. Now, South Sudan had also, during the entire period of the Civil War, fought among themselves as much as they had fought against the North. And the North, of course, put a lot of money into those anti-SPLM militias. But a lot of the violence was between groups in South Sudan. Now, what President Kiir had done in the run-up to the referendum was reach out to all of them with amnesties, et cetera, bring all the militias together and have a true unity going into the referendum and into independence. But what was that when you got to look at it? What you had was not a national army, but an army of various militias that had come together. They were still pretty much in their original form. They were loyal to their commanders who were here or there in the government, outside the government. So it wasn't really a national army, and all the talk of making it such had not taken place. And what about the political party? The political party, they talked about the need to improve the political party, but there was no real support for doing so. So what happened at the end of 2012 and 2013, rather, and now? In part of this creating a big tent, President Kiir reconciled with one of the most controversial people in South Sudan, a man named Riek Machar. Riek Machar had fought against the SPLM, and there was a long memory of massacre that had taken place when he had, supposedly his forces had massacred a lot of the Dinka, who are the leading group in South Sudan. Riek Machar is a newer. But he brought Riek Machar in and made Riek Machar vice president. Didn't like him, didn't give him much power, but he brought him in. And Riek Machar reconciled, and they went through the independence thing together. But by 2012 even, and beyond, people were getting very unhappy with the way Salva Kiir was running the country. The way he made decisions, his reliance on a kind of kitchen cabinet from his home area, and increasingly, the man who had been the big tent man began to see all his critics as enemies, and to rely more and more on a group of what I call securocrats, who convinced him that he had to suppress any opposition. So journalists started to be harassed. Human rights workers were being harassed. A prominent journalist was assassinated. Others were being run out of the country. And we saw this happening in my last trip to South Sudan. This was the focus of my efforts. Our ambassador had raised these issues earlier. And that had created insecurity and uneasiness within the government. So Riek Machar made a decision that he was going to challenge Salva Kiir, the president, first of all for leadership of the party in 2014 and for the presidency in 2015. Now this was a very difficult situation, because as I said to some of the people in the party who were confronted with this, you've got a problem. If you don't give Riek Machar a pathway to the presidency, there's going to be trouble. And if you do give him a pathway to the presidency, there's going to be trouble. But this is what political parties do. This is what political parties have to do. They have to figure a way out of this. You create a president and a prime minister. You do something. But you don't let the thing just evolve into a major crisis. But Salva Kiir dismissed the party institutions, the party mechanism. He fired the head of the party, later jailed him. And in an incident that went violent in December, Riek Machar left the capital, took his army supporters with him, and now we have a terrible, terrible civil war with major human rights violations going on. It's going to be very hard to put this country back together. It's not a question of, well, you just got to get these two guys to reconcile and he'll be vice president again. You can't go back there. That's not possible. The question facing now the diplomacy is, what do you do now? Well, one answer is you need a fundamental political remake of South Sudan. You need a new constitutional process. You need to bring in civil society, the churches and others, and create a constitution that is truly democratic and protects people. And you have a new election on a new basis in 2015, 2016. And in my view, neither Salva Kiir nor Riek Machar is allowed to run. That's one scenario. But how do you enforce it? We're back to the African Union leading this negotiation. How do they enforce that upon the president who says, no, that's not what I see? So there's a fallback. You say, well, the real problem is just within the party. If you can get the party to deal with this rivalry, we can get back to peace. That's very attractive. There's a good article by someone saying this is a great thing in Africa Confidential. I'm very troubled by it. It may be a way to get the conflict toned down, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problems that led to this crisis. So I think we are now faced with an extraordinarily difficult situation. And then we face one other issue in this, and this is an issue that comes up a lot in peace processes: peace and accountability. Some terrible things have gone on in South Sudan in this war. Terrible things. Terrible ethnic violence, because that's what people do. Politicians mobilize around ethnic identity, build that, make that into your security, and you take vengeance. You come up, I've been reading about, these guys did it to us in the 90s. No, they did it to us in the 18th century. They did. You mobilize all those hatreds and bring them out, et cetera. So there's been some terrible human rights violations. Now, how do you get a peace process and accountability? Supposing you have an investigation, you say, well, look, Salva Kiir and his people, and Riek Machar and his people, clearly, like Bashir in Darfur, should be indicted for, or called out for this. But these are the two guys you want to get to the peace table, and you're not going to get them to the peace table. You say, and by the way, as soon as you get here, we're going to arrest you or do something like that. This is not an easy problem to deal with. And yet, if you don't have accountability, if there is no accountability, then all these wrongs, all these terrible things fester and fester and fester, and they break out in some future time. That's one of the big issues. It's the second big issue facing the diplomats. And the third, of course, is how do you control this situation? Do you bring in more peacekeepers? Do you try and take over more of the functions of this country? And can you do it? Can the Africans do it? Can we do it to back them up? Now, the troubling thing, and the thing that I lose a lot of sleep over, is could we have prevented this? Could we have seen this? Could we have stopped this? And I don't know the answer to that. People say, well, wait a minute. The U.S. was the midwife to South Sudan's independence. We do $300 million a year in aid. We do a lot more indirectly through the UN, through the peacekeepers, et cetera. Don't tell me that the U.S. didn't have the influence to stop this. Well, one thing we find out, and I think it's true around the world, is you have influence up to a point until you're talking about a leader's sense of his own survival. At that point, they don't listen very much, because to them, the advice you're giving them, in their view, and this is certainly true of President Kiir, is you're asking him to take risks with his own survival. And his view, his, I would say, almost paranoid view in the last year, is you're asking him things that would lead to his being thrown out, if not killed. And there's where your influence runs up. But still, that's not a satisfactory answer. Could we have done more? Could we have seen this coming in the fall, when the fallout in the political situation was getting worse, in December, when it blew up into the open politically and publicly? I just don't know the answer. I honestly don't know the answer. I was no longer the envoy. I wasn't involved. I know my successor was out there repeatedly.
Can you use the microphone?
Oh, I thought I was on the microphone. No? Maybe I'm not.
It's just a little.
Hello? Better?
Yes.
The question then is, could we have done more? And I know my successor and others were out there intensively during this period, trying very hard to ward this off. Could we have done more earlier? Could we have put more pressure on the South? How would that have affected the relationship with Sudan? Would Sudan have tried to take advantage of that, which is something we worried about throughout the preceding 2 years? Could we have done more with the army? I'll tell you one of the issues that kept us from doing more work with this hodgepodge of an army, and that was the division within the U.S. government about how big a military footprint we should have in South Sudan. Do you bring in AFRICOM and a lot of trainers, et cetera, or is that really militarizing the whole thing and making the U.S. look like it's getting South Sudan ready for war? We never resolved that in the government. So our efforts with the Army were minimal at best. As I say, I don't have the answer to this question. It's a troubling one, and one that will trouble us, I think, for a long time. But even more difficult, I think, is what to do now about bringing this country back together. Let me stop there and we can open it up for questions. I'm sorry if this isn't. Yes,
So it seems like.
could you identify yourself? So
Sure,
it's-
sure. Only two goal. I'm a second year master's student, and I guess full disclosure, I lived in South Sudan for a little bit of time, so I do know a little bit about it. But I had a question about the current state of negotiations. It seems like with Riek Machar's group negotiating in Addis, they've gotten to the table, and yet there's still conflict going on the ground in South Sudan. Do you think is that reflecting? Riek Machar trying to get a better bargaining position, or is that he's lost control over some of his forces, and is that a new worrying trend?
I think it's both. They have on paper, they have a ceasefire. But in fact, there is still struggling between the two sides over key cities like Malakal near the oil fields. And I'm not sure Riek Machar controls things like this White Army, which is a kind of a mobilized militant youth group. And you have David Yao out there. So I don't think there is a unified rebellion command under Machar that controls all of it. So you have a lot of the revenge killing going on, and you have some strategic fighting going on under what is supposed to be a ceasefire. The monitors of this ceasefire are just really arriving on the ground. Yes, sir.
I have two comments. First, put it in proper perspective. You should realize that we were just returning from Vietnam at that time, and I had a very sad experience there. Second, they are still trying to determine blame for our lack of energy in some African country that suffered great deaths and mutilations. With that in mind, and the fact that slavery is both a legal and traditional form or activity in Sudan, would you feel that this helps explain the fact that the United States takes no real action in Sudan?
Can it help you to take 2 or 3 questions at once?
Sure.
Why don't we open the floor for 1 or 2 more questions, and we can address them all at the same time.
I wondered if you knew of a man named David Ceremka. He's an American Quaker who started the African Great Lakes Initiative. Now, he's worked a little bit south of Sudan, but he wrote this book, A Piece of Africa, and he's done some phenomenal work with intertribal violence and a program called Healing and Restoring Our Communities.
Yeah.
One last question here, Amanda.
Thanks, Ambassador, for coming. 2 quick questions, or should I limit it to one for now? I can limit it to one. Okay, one question about the negotiations, which, so you mentioned this briefly. In terms of the imbalance in U.S. leverage between the two parties, Sudan and South Sudan, with us having considerably more leverage over the South, how do you feel, if at all, that affected the outcome of the September 2013 agreement? And I guess I'm alluding a bit to the fact that at the end of the day, a couple of key issues were left out, as you mentioned, including Abyei and some of the other unresolved border disputes.
Well, let me take those 3 then. First of all, other than military action, you have to say that the U.S. was heavily invested in the Sudan situation. I mean, diplomatically. I had to testify when I first came on in the envoy's job in 2011. Congressman asked me how much money we had spent on South Sudan since 2005. The answer was $10 billion, which shocked me as well as everybody on the Hill. It's now over 12. So to say that we weren't heavily invested, we were. We weren't invested militarily for a lot of reasons we can go into, but diplomatically, economically, and in any other way, I think we were. I think it's the exception to what you're talking about, that is the willingness to go in heavily. On your point, here's another thing that is troubling, I guess. We were running, USAID was running a number of programs like that in South Sudan in the 2005 to 2013, particularly after 2011. Some of them very successful. There was also another reconciliation process going on. The sad thing is, when the political structures break down and people go out and arms were just, there's all the arms anybody could ever want washing around South Sudan. All that breaks down. All that you've accomplished somehow, not all of it, breaks down because people are mobilized. You arm those elements who don't want peace, they take action, then the others want revenge, etc. So the efforts that we did in South Sudan have really broken down, sadly. Now, that doesn't mean they don't work, and they don't work in other cases, but they didn't prevent what happened in South Sudan. That doesn't answer your question?
No. I'll give you the book if you want it.
Yeah.
It's very different. He has some comments about the UN work that's been done. It's very different from the stuff he does.
Okay, well, we can do that. And look, there are a lot of good programs like that, don't get me wrong. The sad thing is, and we have had some that were remarkably successful in overcoming conflicts, both Sudan and South Sudan. And yet they collapsed in the wake of these pressures. That's what's troubling to me, but I'm happy to get that reference. The question of, you meant the summit of 2012, I think, the 9 agreements. I think they were extremely valuable. I think it was extremely important because, in my view, if South Sudan didn't get on with building itself and get rid of its preoccupation with Sudan and all the issues with Sudan, it would never solve its own problems. One of my problems with South Sudan, published a piece on this in early 2013, was the preoccupation with all possible issues over borders, over this and that, was keeping it from focusing on its own weaknesses and problems. So the agreements of 2012, yes, they didn't resolve APA, which broke down one of the main elements of their strategy. But it solved the oil problem, which both countries had to solve. South Sudan, by the way, was bankrupt at the end of 2012, absolutely, totally bankrupt. And they went into debt, we now know, $3.5 billion during that year. And now, that was one of the things that brought about this political rupture. Where did that money come from, and how come no one do it? You had to solve the oil issue. You had to get a process for demilitarizing the border, because they were fighting on the border, and all the other things. So I think it was a very valuable thing. The people who were opposed to it, and this did frustrate me, we didn't get this piece of territory. We didn't get that piece of territory. And I would say 40% of your people are being fed by the international community. That ought to be your priority. Not that you didn't get Heglig, not that you didn't get the 14-mile area. So the 2012 agreements opened the door for doing that. Now, it wasn't perfect, but my view is that was a significant achievement if the two countries had taken advantage of it. Yeah.
To what do you attribute the inability of the administration to decide on a policy, as you indicated, for example, the military footprint? By the time South Sudan comes into being, the domestic factors are now, in a sense, unified in victory. They had successfully opposed Sudan. So there's no domestic pressure against the administration. What accounts for the problem?
There were three things. We never while we provided a lot of military assistance to South Sudan, we never gave them lethal assistance. We never wanted to give in to the Sudan accusation that we wanted the independence of South Sudan as a launching pad to overthrow the government of al-Bashir in Khartoum. That was their view of our policy. So to have given lethal aid to the government of South Sudan would have played into that. The difference over military presence actually, in part, was over housing. There was no housing for Americans in Juba. And people said, you know, how many civilians are you going to displace to bring in 12 military? But we also couldn't agree on the priorities. And there was a split, frankly, within the administration. I happen to be very much in favor of forging a very strong relationship with the South Sudan military on a mill-build basis. But there were other people who were opposed, who thought that was the wrong way to go, and we never really resolved it.
I'm curious as to, with all the billions we've given Sudan, could you give us an idea of what that money is spent on?
A lot of it, a very large amount of it, is humanitarian aid. For example, in Darfur, we're feeding 2 million people, still displaced from the Darfur. In South Sudan, as I mentioned, the International World Food Program feeds 40% of the population, now probably more. Then you have peacekeepers. You have 3 peacekeeping operations. You have one in South Sudan, you have one in Darfur, and you have a special one in this disputed area of Abyei. We pay 25% of UN peacekeeping costs. So that's been going on for a number of years. And then you have the regular assistance program I talked about in health and education and training, et cetera, which was running about $300 million a year. So you add it all up, and it comes to $1 billion a year, and 8 or 9 years, you're spending $10, $11 billion. It adds up.
This is a simpler question than the answer might be, but in your role as diplomat and negotiator, are you served better if the United States is perceived as a strong world power or a member of the world global community?
There's an advantage to being seen as the global power, but there's also a disadvantage. The disadvantage is they assume you can do anything. And if things don't go right, it's because you didn't decide to do it. So, for example, just on the Sudan thing, the Sudanese government felt, look, if we really wanted, we could have taken them off the state sponsors of terrorism, as if Congress didn't matter in that. Or that we could control totally the South Sudanese on anything and everything they do. So the negative side is they expect more. The positive side is that it gets you in the room and a lot of influence. So if you're not considered a player, there must have been 10, 12 special envoys for Sudan around the world. I'd say 4 of us counted, because we were from countries that had a stake in it and were willing to put resources. US, Britain, Norway, China, EU, they mattered. There were a lot of other envoys who came in and out who didn't matter. Yes, ma'am.
I'll add a question. Why don't we do 1, 2?
1,
Okay.
2.
Hi, I'm Yasmin. I'm a senior. And my question is sort of, to what extent would you say that the current political crisis is one of personal rivalries or complete institutional failure? And given that, is there a concern in light of negotiations in Addis of sort of legitimizing individuals, particularly Machar, who I think in light of the I think the political trial that was had a couple days ago that was releasing sort of intercepts and transcripts of a coordinated coup plot. Is there a concern of legitimizing certain individuals in this type of negotiation setting?
Ambassador, how important was President Museveni's role during this process? And what did Uganda really expect to get out of the peace process?
In the current crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first, look, it's more than personal, although it is very personal between Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, but they represent different things. As I mentioned, Salva Kiir Riek Machar fought against the SPLM for a very long period of time and came into the government and was not given much authority and was sort of sitting on the sidelines. A very ambitious man who clearly wants to be president of the country. But he drew support not for his presidency, but for the challenge to Kiir from people within the Kiir government, from Dengalore, from Paganimun, and people like that, who said, this country isn't being run right, and the party isn't being consulted, and it isn't working. They sided with Riek Machar in criticizing Salva Kiir. Paganimun said, I'll run for president. But they didn't support Riek Machar's presidency in the process, but in the breakdown. Now, the coup, the evidence is that it wasn't a coup. We can't be sure, but our Assistant Secretary for Africa, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, has gone on record saying there's no evidence of a coup. A fight did break out in the Guard between Nur and Dinka units, but whether it was a coup is very, very questionable. It's more, if it was the two, you could have this, let's bring up the two guys together, but it's much more than that. It goes to fundamental disagreements and now grievances that are running very, very deep among elements of the population. It's more than two people. Now, Uganda, I'm glad you raised it because it's a very important issue. Uganda is a strong supporter of South Sudan, has a big economic stake, has a political stake. The problem in this situation is that Museveni makes no secret of the fact that he would like to overthrow the government in Khartoum of Sudan. Therefore, when Uganda, and what they did in this current crisis, Uganda sent troops into South Sudan. Now, at first they said they were only doing it to stabilize the capital of Juba and keep the rebels from coming down, and that was probably useful. But then they started fighting up in Bor and elsewhere. This has alarmed Sudan. They were saying, no, wait a minute, is this going to be now Museveni using South Sudan to get at Sudan? And the presence of the Ugandans also complicates the peace, this group, this regional group, IGAD it's called, the International Group Against, I don't know, I forgot, it used to be against drought, but they changed their name. It consists of Uganda, it consists of Kenya, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Now, this group is supposed to be working on the peace process, but you have Sudan and Uganda sitting in the group, which complicates it. So I think Museveni right now is playing a not very helpful role. And I think that it would be very important for him at least to pull back his troops only to the capital, if not to withdraw. Yes,
I have one question.
sure.
I'll ask two unless there's one more. The first is, are there any historical examples that you draw on to help explain the situation or at least shed light on different aspects? I know this is somewhat novel in that the international community has prevented breakaway states, but are there other political movements that shed light on, and that might be putting you on the spot, so feel free to think about that. But the second question is, you have articulated a number of possible kind of motivating factors for conflict, and you've emphasized the grievance aspect very heavily, so I completely agree with you. Putting that to the side, what are some of the economic motivations, and how could various groups monetize their participation in conflict? Even the mechanics of, we all can understand there are oil revenues at stake. How does one actually operationalize that? If you own a piece of territory where people strike deals with you, do you have to own a legitimate piece of state apparatus before you can begin to monetize that? Maybe just think through some of the economic mechanisms.
Well, and it goes to your first question too, but let me deal with the second question. 98% of South Sudan's budget comes from oil. The question is, how do you use the oil revenue? A lot of it's been lost through corruption. It's very hard to find evidence of much else, and to the army. If you had a constitutional federal system in which you allocated that money much more to regions, yeah, you might have political warlords kind of things in different regions, but you would be spreading real wealth and therefore real power, monetized power, and patronage. Look, patronage works. I mean, Sudan has run that country for years on patronage. It's not the ideal. You hopefully you're building a better democracy, but you can, as you say, monetize the rivalries, the contending interests, et cetera. And they have enough money to do it. Some countries don't have enough money to do it. They actually do. That's why, in my view, you need fundamentally to restructure the politics of the country so that everybody in that country feels that they're going to get a fair share of the opportunities and the wealth, and that hasn't been happening.
If you're Machar, do you need to take Juba in order to access oil wealth? Or is there a way for you to somehow capture some of this revenue without necessarily winning a revolution? Or
He can't capture the revenue. He can disrupt, if he gets control of the wells, he can disrupt the production. And a lot of the production's been disrupted. And that hurts Salva Kiir. But the money, the sales go out through Port Sudan, and they go into an account that's been worked out, so he wouldn't have access to that.
So that's not there's no motivation there to
No,
rebel?
no, his motivation is much more political and territorial. On your first question, examples elsewhere, you know, there are a lot of situations, and you mentioned the Congo, where you just have so many opportunities, if you can call it that, for various forces to mobilize people and disrupt a process, disrupt the government, disrupt the peace process. It's very hard to control it. And it's harder to control it when people at the center have a stake in mucking around in those things. Or, as in the case of Congo, if Rwanda and Uganda and Burundi also have a stake in mucking around in those things. So it's hard to bring those under control. But you know, a colleague of Dan's and mine, Jim Dobbins, who now is the special envoy for Afghanistan, Pakistan, but did a lot of work on the Balkans and has written a lot on peacekeeping, said, look, what you want to do in a peace process, just the peace process, is to take all those rivalries and move them from being settled violently to being settled politically. If you do that, you've done now, you still may leave that country X as a small poverty country, but they're not killing each other. That's what peacemaking ought to be, and be happy if you do that. If you could have a period of time in which you could really remake the politics of South Sudan. And the sad thing is, I think Kiir could have done that. He was the unifier in 2011. And here's the irony. I mentioned Paganamun was Secretary General of the party. He's now in jail. Paganamun said to me in 2011, he said, we must keep Salva Kiir in the presidency because he's the only one who can unify the country. And that's the irony, because years later, Salva Kiir threw that all away, in my view. Tony.
Ambassador, if I could make a comparison or ask you to think about Rwanda and Kagame and what's going on in Sudan. Do you think that Rwanda actually is a success story?
It depends on what elements you're looking at. Of course, the genocide leaves a long, long legacy. You don't just overcome it because it's over, and et cetera. And it colors not only the politics and the administration of Rwanda, it colors the politics of the region, and it colors the attitudes of the international community toward Kagame. Having said all that, he administers that country extremely well. People who work in the HIV area, for example, say there's no place better, no better support you can get from the government there. And it's true on the economics, and he's brought Rwanda into the East Africa Union, and he's done all those things. But he's not the least bit democratic, and he crushes opposition. He also uses the existence of some of the genocidaires in Congo as an excuse to constantly be moving into the Congo for monetary as much as any other reason. So you have to give him a mixed report card. And that's one of the hard things of dealing with him. I remember watching him being interviewed by Fareed Zakaria and said, is this the new face of the good Africa? Well, yes, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. Yes, ma'am.
Any overall lessons learned from working with the African Union on the negotiation process?
Yeah.
Just a little bit more on limits and their strengths?
It's a very, very important thing, because the question is, first of all, is the African Union the right instrument? Second, are they capable of doing it, and what are the pluses and minuses? We got into this attitude some years ago, African solutions to African problems, which some of the Africans like and some of them don't like, because it looks like, you don't say that about Asia or Latin America. It is important, I think, nowadays to have the African Union playing a major role, because there are no Western governments, with perhaps the exception of France and a place like Cote d'Ivoire, that can really step in that degree of political weight and influence to do it. But what we ran into, and what Thabo Mbeki, who runs the panel on negotiations on South Sudan, discovered is that once he moves from facilitation to mediation, once he says, okay, I've heard this Abyei problem for too long, here's the solution, and the African Union endorses it, and Sudan says, okay, now what are you going to do? And the African Union says, how about 6 more months of negotiations? Because the enforceability is limited. It's also true on the peacekeeping side. The African Union's come a long way in developing African peacekeeping initiatives, et cetera, but almost every African Union peacekeeping force eventually morphs into a UN one, because they can't afford it. So, yes, they're very valuable. I couldn't have worked without them on Sudan and South Sudan, no question about it. But they have to also recognize that they need outside support to do what they need to do. And when you put those two together, it works. Dan?
Could you comment on the role, what role, if any, Egypt played in this? Were we lucky that Egypt was going through a revolution during this period and decided not to meddle?
You know, the Egyptians have an on and off relationship with Sudan for a long period of time. Their preoccupation, as you know well, is the Nile. And what happens to the Nile and all the negotiations over the use of the Nile. When Morsi was elected, al-Bashir and Libya elected or got rid of Gaddafi, Bashir, the president of Sudan, said, now I'm in a good shape. I've got Muslim Brotherhood on both sides of me, and I'm now in a very good position. So he was not at all happy about the military. But it's important for Sudan to maintain a decent relationship with Egypt. Egypt did not play a big role in the negotiation. They were against the referendum for the South. Mubarak was against it. The last 2 people to come to Khartoum and argue against the referendum were Mubarak and Gaddafi. But they accepted it. And the Egyptians began to invest in South Sudan, setting up scholarships, et cetera. They tend in African Union fora and in the UN to take Khartoum's side. So they weren't all that helpful when we wanted more pressure on Khartoum. But they weren't a problem either.
Any other questions? All right, well, Ambassador, thank you so much.
Thank
for
you
your time.
all. Thank you very much.